We're all familiar with the magazine Nintendo Power, which was in print between 1988 and 2012, and nowadays lives on through Nintendo Force. But we're not all Americans. I'm Swedish, and when I was a kid there was Nintendomagasinet. It was only around between 1990 and 1994, and when I was a kid I only ever had or read 2 of them. But today I've collected 18 out of 41 total. They're jam-packed with nostalgia. Here is a collection of tidbits that I've selected from the ones that I own. With the knowledge I have today, it's really fun to look through these magazines for news and updates on upcoming games. Unavoidably, they made a lot of mistakes in predicting the future of certain games and game titles. In issue 492, it says Nintendo has an upcoming game called Solar Tropics. Today we know it went on to be called Star Tropics. They report that Mega Man 5 is rumored to have a female protagonist, and until this day that's never happened. A Capcom representative said in 1992 that they had no plans on bringing Street Fighter 2 to Sega consoles, because that might upset Nintendo. Well, they did, first with the Champion Edition and later on every other console imaginable. They report that the successor to Mario Paint might be coming out called Music Soft, and in a later issue they referred to it as Sound Fantasy, with a screenshot included. To my knowledge, Nintendo never made any music creation games whatsoever. Not sure if Electroplankton would count. Kirby's Dream Course came out here, but in the magazine they thought it was going to be called Kirby's Tee-Shot. Not the worst name since the game is kind of similar to golf. I'd say it's better than the Japanese title, Kirby Bowl, because it doesn't have anything to do with bowling. Shadowgate was one of the games I owned as a kid, and it was actually localized into Swedish. Although they used the wrong letter in 2 of the commands, you won't understand it, but it's supposed to be gå and slå, not gä and slä. Anyway, Shadowgate was quite popular in Sweden. There were many ports and 2 semi-sequels, one on TurboGrafx 16 CD called Beyond Shadowgate, and one on Nintendo 64 called Shadowgate 64 Trials of the Four Towers. But issue 992 says there's a Shadowgate 2 on home computers out already. That's not true. In issue 693 there's a bunch of games that either never came out here or not by the same names, like Mario Collection eventually came out as Super Mario All-Stars, and Super Mario Collection was the Japanese title. Mario and Wario, a puzzle platformer controlled by the SNES mouse made by Pokémon creators Game Freak, never came out outside of Japan. Yoshi's Hunting eventually became Yoshi's Safari. Mega Man 6 never came out in Europe either. I'm not sure what Super Mega Man is, probably Mega Man X. Ys 4 and Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 on Super Nintendo never left Japan. Another news-related thing is the ongoing news and rumors about the Super Nintendo CD attachment. Reading this is interesting because I didn't know of the CD attachment until maybe a few years ago. If only I would have read this. In issue 891, a guy in the mailbox asks about the upcoming Sega CD, and the magazine guy talks about the TurboGrafx 16 CD and that it's rumored that Nintendo and Sony are cooperating on a CD attachment for the SNES. Issue 592 brings it up again, but this time with Philips as the partner, along with a sketch for the thing. It looks like a Teleview. The very next issue actually explains that Nintendo changed their mind and went from Sony to Philips, but also mentions the Sony PlayStation by name for the first time. The following year they devoted a full page to it and showed the disc inside of a plastic case, kind of how DVD RAM looked like, or the later 64 disk drive. It says it'll have a 21.477 MHz processor and will come out in the US by fall of 1993. Today we know it never came out. The Philips CDI and the Sony PlayStation did, however. The CDI was terrible and the PlayStation was great, turning Nintendo into followers instead of leaders for 2 whole generations of consoles. On this theme of failure, here are some complaints from people. Why does it take such a long time for games to come to Sweden? And why are so few of the games released in the US being released in Sweden? Don't tell me there's too much violence in them. There's violence in all the games today. Release schedules are very annoying, even more so today when we know so much about the games coming out. At least it doesn't take years anymore, more like months. I think the content in the magazine is good, but too outdated. If you read foreign magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly, Mean Machines, or GamePro, you'll know everything that's in Nintendomagasinet months in advance. Yes, but how did this guy get a hold of foreign magazines? I never knew it was possible myself. We are 3 guys who has realized how bad Nintendo is compared to Sega. For instance, compare Quackshot with Super Mario. Donald wipes the floor with what remains of Mario after Sonic got through with him. Furthermore, you say that the Game Boy is the best handheld. But Sega's Game Gear has 4096 colors, and Game Boy doesn't even have one. The Game Gear games are arcade-like. Quite obviously, a Sega fanboy, personally I think Quackshot is a fine game, but it has nothing on Super Mario Bros. 3 or Super Mario World. Game Gear did have color, but the Game Boy had much better games in my and most people's opinion. Why are Nintendo always so far behind technologically? Sega's CD-ROM has existed a long time, and when is Nintendo CD coming out? It'll probably be delayed like usual. Signed, Jonas, Anders and Mr. Smartass. It's ironic to read this today after years and years of similar whining in response to both the Wii and the Wii U and so on. History repeats itself. Of course, the people writing the magazines had some opinions of their own too. In issue 391 they give their 2 cents on the Power Glove. When is the Power Glove coming to Sweden? Mattel's Power Glove doesn't actually work very well. It's also very expensive and only works with certain games. It's probably never going to be released in Sweden. And it never was. But the magazine did raffle off a couple of them at one point. They're correct about it not working too well, but it does work with any NES game. It's just that there were only 2 games that were actually made for it, just like with Rob the Robot. In issue 6791, a guy asks about which came first, Super Mario Bros. Or Super Giana Sisters. Super Giana Sisters is a fairly famous game for the Commodore 64. It's a clone of Super Mario Bros., but with sisters instead of brothers. It gained some infamy and eventually got a game on the Nintendo DS. In their review of Gremlins 2 on the Game Boy, they say that it's better than the one on NES. The one on NES happens to be one of the games I had as a kid, and a great one at that. It's definitely much better than the Game Boy one, which is just a mediocre platformer. Speaking of reviews, they do Adventure Island but give it a difficulty ranking of medium. That lets you know that they never made it to the end of this really hard game. In a preview of Bubsy, they think it's good. On top of the game looking good and having good music, it also contains some humor. I agree with the music and maybe the graphics too, but the humor is not fun. And also no mention of the bad controls and gameplay. When a guy writes in asking who they think makes the best games for the NES, they reply that THQ makes, quote, mostly junk. I would have to agree. Another thing I agree with is in issue 394 where a guy asks if Shadowrun will come to Sweden, and they reply that it probably won't, though it did, and that they can't comprehend why Nintendo of Sweden would bring in a game like Young Merlin and not Final Fantasy II. In 1993 they finally grudgingly spoke well of Sega, commending their arcade games. But other competitors didn't fare as well as in the same issue when they say that the Neo Geo is, quote, a system for people with more money than brains. I like to nitpick. And beside the errors about upcoming games, they also made some small errors that are funny to point out. In issue 290 someone is asking questions about Double Dragon 2, but they put in a picture of Ninja Gaiden for some reason. In issue 693 they put in the wrong picture of Castlevania 2. They were asked about Simon's Quest, and they used a picture of Belmont's Revenge. In the same issue they have a big summation of the Final Fantasy series to that point, even though as far as I know it wasn't until Final Fantasy VII that the series was actually available in Sweden. But what's weirder is that even though it's an article on the whole series, all of the pictures are from Final Fantasy Adventure on Game Boy. Kind of misleading. In the Christmas issue of 1991 they have a quiz on Mega Man 2, and one of the questions is wrong. They ask how many points you get for defeating Dr. Wily, but the point system was only in Mega Man 1, not any of the other games. In most of the magazines there would be one or more ads from game stores by mail order. In one of them I noticed several typos, like Turtles instead of Turtles, Blades Ooze Steel, Guardian Legend, Trick Shooting, Zap-Per, Axelay, Scoop, Revenge of the Gator, Gargoyle's Quest, Game Gear plus Koyums. Also, if I could travel back in time and buy Little Samson and Euphoria for like a total of 550 Swedish crowns, I would do it in a heartbeat. Now for some miscellaneous stuff. Cosplay seems like a recent trend, but from the 394 issue we can see these two dressing up as Cammy and Chun-Li. Also in 1991 there's a hideous Mega Man suit. In issue 491 the rumor was that Danny DeVito was going to play Mario in the movie. As we know, Bob Hoskins got the role, but for DeVito I'd say he dodged a bullet there. Reading these I found out a couple of things about my favorite game Super Mario Bros. 3. First, that one of the animal transformations considered for the game was Mario as a centaur, and in another issue there's a map of some stages, and there I found an area with coins in the air that I didn't know about before. I never tried flying in that part. In one issue, a guy writes in and says that he tried to buy some game from the toy store, but that they didn't stock it because it was too violent. The debate about video game violence is an old one, indeed. A staple in the magazines were the comics. I guess I read what was there back then, but nowadays I don't have much interest in them. But I want to tell you about one part that caught my eye. In the A Link to the Past comic, at one point Link receives a mask from Azora and is told to go to the Temple of Darkness. Above the temple is a sinister looking moon. The moon doesn't do anything, but the mask and that moon, the whole thing reminds me of Majora's Mask. This was 6 years before the game came out, and I'm not saying this was the inspiration, probably not, but still an interesting coincidence. Well, that's it. I still try to find more issues of this magazine because I really enjoy reading it and getting showered with nostalgia, as well as having hindsight on all the old news. Once I ordered a bunch of magazines from Swedish eBay, but I only got an empty envelope in a plastic bag and a note from the post office saying, "Sorry, it seems someone stole the contents of your package." And they couldn't reimburse me either. So I guess these magazines are still highly sought after indeed.